Thank you all so much for coming. This is really exciting and wonderful for me. I'm very anxious, but in a good way. And thank you to Green Apple Books on the Park for hosting. This is one of my favorite bookstores in the world. It is one of the smartest people I know, one of the best writers, and is working on his own novel, which I've had the good fortune to read a small portion of, and it's beautiful, and it's like going to be the great California novel. And
you've written the Great California novel.
Well, I'll take the north part. He hails from Southern California, and that's very different. So, anyway, I just hope you'll look out for that, and also look out for his work in places like The Nation, Slate. He's just really a wonderful reader and writer.
He's like one of the kindest people in the world, and I'm so happy to be sharing this evening with her, and to be sharing the debut of this fantastic novel with all of you. So just a round of applause for Lydia for being amazing. So I really like that passage because it kind of gets at with the novel, the interesting innovation that the novel is making in terms of the road novel, because it is a road novel, but before you can even get to the beauty of the wide open of California's landscape, you get this child who's screaming and vomiting and is causing a scene. Those two things don't go together. Where'd you get the idea to pair an unruly child with a road novel, and what were you trying to accomplish in doing that?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. I think one of the first kind of feelings I had that made me think I wanted to write a book is when I had my first daughter, who is now almost 4. And I remember when she was very small having such a strong feeling that if I could just, things were challenging, not because of her, but just because of the kind of circumstances of life when you have a small child and when you're working, just kind of arranging your life becomes very challenging, and most people don't have adequate parental leave, and I had fine parental leave, but it wasn't great, and I just was so resentful about how quickly I felt like I needed to go back to work. And so I had this idea that if I could just go somewhere alone with the baby, we would be fine, and there's nothing wrong with babies, it's just society that sucks. And but I had this feeling while knowing that if I were to be alone with the baby, I would be absolutely miserable. And there is no evidence that I would thrive in that situation. And that feeling, that kind of paradox was really interesting to me. And so I started thinking about what, who would that make more sense for? Who would actually make the choice to just take the baby and go somewhere and get on the road. And Daphne, the protagonist, who is very similar to me, but is not me, she does have the conditions where she gets up and does that, but she still kind of gets where she's going and finds that it's not, there's no place where you can go where it just makes everything feel fine and okay.
But definitely not Northern California. I guess, what's your personal connection to Northern California? Why was that the kind of telos that Daphne had to head to?
Well, so around my mom grew up in Modoc County, so the book takes place in fictional Piute County, but anyone who's been to Modoc County it's basically that's where it takes place. And the town is Alta Vista, and the real town is Alturas, and it's a pretty ham-fisted disguise. But when I started writing, I felt like I needed a little bit more freedom, and so making it fictional was the kind of obvious way for me to do that. But so my mom is from Modoc County, from Alturas, and when I was growing up, we lived all over the place because my dad, who's here, was in the Foreign Service, and so we would go to Alturas on home leave. We would go on visits, and we'd go every year, and it was this wonderfully exotic place to me, and I loved it so much, and I loved seeing my grandparents, and I would eat ice cream and watch Nick at Night and just be in the wide open spaces. And I told my grandparents at one point that I wanted to have my honeymoon in Alturas because it was so special to me. And they died in the, like, around 2008. And since then, I've been up a few times, but it's not, there's not a reason to go anymore. And so I thought a lot about that and how I felt like I had kind of claims on this place, but I didn't actually have them in any real sense. And sort of thinking about that place like fading out of my life was really sad to me, especially as I was having my own children. So I don't know, I needed to like write about it in some way.
It's interesting that like Daphne feels the same kind of attachment to Paiute County, but it's not like the nostalgia of somebody who like grew up there and like appreciates the kind of, I'm not sure what to call it, like white, working class white culture of Paiute County, and it's funny how she like manages to navigate a kind of nostalgia for this culture that she like not only grew up around, but also feels like she has to keep it at arm's length. Like, how are you thinking about white nostalgia, and like, because it's a scary thing, but Daphne like raised the prospect for me that it could be done responsibly or like in a non-scary way.
She dabbles in it. That's also a great question. So yes, one of the other things that has kind of been going on in the last few years in my life is, I've had children and people have died and like places change that are once important to me. So I do think, I have a lot of kind of romance wrapped up in how I see this place where my mom grew up. But, there's a place in the book which is something I do think about. Like, my grandparents died before there was any Donald Trump. And I really firmly believe that they wouldn't have voted for Donald Trump. But I actually don't have that information, and I can't, like, really, guarantee that to myself. And so a lot of, kind of the feelings of, like, romance when I look back at the place. Like, I saw a picture of my grandfather recently with a bunch of, like, good old boys, and it's, like, a great picture. They're all wearing cowboy hats. It was on a hunting trip. But I was like, oh, they all voted for Barry Goldwater. Like, well, most of them, probably. So that's something that you have to kind of think about as you're thinking about, like, lost ways of life. And it is, there are things that are really sad to me when I see, when I go to Alturas, like, businesses that have closed down and just, like, a general kind of depopulation and I know it's really sad for my mom to feel like it was a great place to grow up and now it just doesn't have the same kind of energy, but like many sort of places that were great places to grow up, it's like, who was it a great place to grow up and why, and what other things were happening at the same time. It's like you have to think about that.
I wasn't going to bring up Trump. I'm glad you did. Like it's the book does a good job of like straddling a kind of like disdain for the State of Jefferson successionist. Can you so first explain like what the State of Jefferson is, and I'll keep going for
Okay.
people who don't know.
So the State of Jefferson is a movement, I guess you could call it, a political ideal that has existed for a long time, famously, or not famously, but famously, in 1941 on the border. So the territory of the State of Jefferson is meant to be far northern California and southern Oregon, depending on who you're talking to. And typically it's, the idea is that if this state existed, it'd be a state of the union, 51st state, but they would be able to make their own rules regarding extractive industries, logging, mining, would be able to control kind of dams and water. And, the idea is that like the federal government, the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management have been kind of trampling on what people's freedoms. There are a lot of problems with that, like with something, that kind of simplistic way of seeing it. But in 1941, the the state of Jefferson seceded every Thursday until future notice, and it was interrupted by Pearl Harbor, so they stopped. But they stood by the highway on the Siskiyou County border, and they didn't actually stop cars from entering, but they would like give them a proclamation of the state of Jefferson and say that you were entering state of Jefferson land. And so it's not, it's its own kind of regional thing, but it does have some overlap with the things that have been going on with like the Bundy ranchers, the Maller standoff in Oregon. Kind of the idea that like the federal government imposes these like onerous, arbitrary standards on people, but state of Jefferson it's more focused on being pissed at the state of California, and the idea that like Sacramento, San Francisco, LA kind of control, make decisions for people living in the far north state, which is not, unfair. That is like their concerns are probably not represented in quite the way they would like, but yeah, so that's the state of Jefferson.
Right, so listen to that description, I think it's easy to be like, oh, these people are crazy, like they're insane, they're people who we don't want any involvement with. But like the book manages to have a kind of empathy for them that I didn't expect, for the possibility that maybe like LA or the Bay or Sacramento can understand their plight or legislate in a way that's helpful for them. And I know you were writing this book like during the election or after Trump's election, but I wonder if now you're thinking at all about like kind of like expanded empathy for people who we see as like being violent and like just disorderly.
Well, I mean, the reason that state of Jefferson kind of appeals is the wrong word, but like was interesting to me is that if you go up to those parts of California, like it is so different. Like it's just, I mean, the way that people interact with space is so different, and just, I mean, it's really kind of astonishing to me. And so, like in that sense, of course, someone who lives in San Francisco and has no opinions about like where cattle should and should not graze, like it feels kind of presumptuous for me to have an opinion about that kind of thing. So I'm happy to say I'm not qualified to like weigh in on these matters. At the same time, actually, when we were having dinner before this, I got a New York Times alert about Native people who live along the Oregon border on the Klamath River, and the salmon runs that have been like absolutely decimated, and then the like corresponding opioid crisis. So that's the way the article was framed, and that's like state of Jefferson territory. And so that's like a whole other population of people who are like, whose interests are not being represented either by the state or by the like, this new kind of state entity. And so in kind of the California side, I won't get into like a long kind of disposition about how it all works out, but like closer to Oregon, there's been like a very hostile and awful kind of campaign waged against Native people who have a different idea of what should go on with like salmon runs and water rights. And so, all at the same time that I'm saying, yes, like people who live in these rural counties like do have a better understanding of how resources should be managed probably than I do, there are also other people within that land who have yet another idea of how it should be managed. So it's not as easy as just saying like, just as when you're talking about like the white working class Trump areas, like there are lots of people who are not in the white working class, who are in the working class, who live in the same areas, and like their views aren't being represented by this kind of monolithic notion of the working class that we have now. Sorry, that really wandered.
You answered the question. When I was reading the book, I think the like precursor that most clearly came to mind was Angular Repos by Stegner, and it's a similar story about a guy who like goes back home to like Grass Valley in Northern California to like discover his family's roots in rural California. But it's a book that manages to not engage at all with the question of like the Native presence in Northern California. I wonder how you think about your book interacting with kind of prior literatures of like white nostalgia for like the frontier.
I'm embarrassed because I did read Angle of Repose like a really long time ago, but I remember nothing that happened in it. I actually didn't know until you said it that it took place in California. So, I mean, when I was thinking about writing about California, I don't have like a real sort of canon of like Western literature. I think right now there are a lot of really amazing and interesting books being written about like the West, so to speak, and sort of renegotiating like how we think of like Western books. But honestly, the book that felt the most kind of like empowering to me is like this is a kind of place that you can write about is a book by Michelle Hunnevin called Off Course, which was published like maybe 8 years or 5 years ago, and it's just about a woman from Southern California who is trying to finish her dissertation, and she drives into the Eastern Sierra, but the southern part of the Eastern Sierra, and stays in her family's like A-frame cabin, and it's kind of a seasonal community, and she like has some dalliances with local gentlemen, and it's a really like weird book in many ways because it's just you're like, why is this happening? But that's exactly the kind of book that I ended up writing. I think a lot of it was because it's like, oh, you can write about these places that just where the place is a character and how people interact with the place. That's just has merit in and of itself.
Yeah. And what other books were on your mind when you were writing this? We discussed How Stella Got Her Groove Back before. If you want to start with that one.
So How Stella Got Her Groove Back is a book that I read a lot when I was younger. I got it. So my grandmother, who's also here, owned a used paperback bookstore in Menlo Park for many years called the Book Rack, and it was very formative for me. I got a lot of books there, and one of them was How Stella Got Her Groove Back, which has first-person present tense narration, which is actually very rare. And there's like very little punctuation. So in the reviews that I've seen of my book, and people are like, she does these really interesting things with no punctuation. I'm like, in fact, no. Many people have done that, and chief among them is Terry McMillan, How Stella Got Her Groove Back. And I didn't realize until actually recently I was like looking at it again, and I had a moment of panic that I discussed with you about how I was like, I actually plagiarized How Stella Got Her Groove Back, which I did not. I don't think that I did, but like that voice I think made an impression on me. Another voice that was very kind of instrumental was Mating by Norman Rush, which also has a first-person female narrator who is like doing something that you just don't understand why she's doing it, and it's objectively like stupid, and she's so smart and so kind of aware, even while she's doing these dumb things, and that really spoke to me a lot. The Last Samurai was a book that meant a lot to me, Helen DeWitt.
Yeah, I have to ask about the first person present tense because after like you read like 50 pages in and you kind of like enter Daphne's headspace, but when you first encounter it, it's like, holy shit, this person's like thinking a mile a minute. And I was trying to imagine like how was Lydia writing this book and like inhabiting this person's mind for like a year. What is it like to write in that voice?
Well, I want to like finesse this because I want to make it seem like I did a better job than just being like, my brain. I mean, I did. I think I took many attributes of myself and the way I tend to think about things, and then I just like really gave them free rein. But then also a lot of it was just problem solving, like, you know, things have to happen in the story, you know, in the present time and like move things forward. But you also, you know, need to understand things about the protagonist and like why she's doing anything that she's doing. And so, you know, there are a lot of, she really veers back and forth and like being in the moment, but then also thinking about her past and her work and, you know, but I mean, that's just how people are, I think. It's like you'll be sitting doing something and then you think about a coworker you had that drove you crazy and, you know, I don't know. I don't really have a good answer to that, but it felt pretty natural to me, let's put it that way.
Fair answer. Just going back to motherhood for a second. There was that interview that Laura Groff did for like the Harvard Crimson maybe like a month ago, where basically somebody asked her like, how do you write and be a mother simultaneously. Like, what's up with that? And her response is basically like, until you ask a man that question, like, don't talk to me about that. Which is a good answer, a fair answer. But also, like, Daphne's experience makes clear that, like, having a child, even if this is like an exceptional situation, right? Her husband is not around. Having a child, like, changes the way you think and, like, the way you perceive your body in the world. So I wonder if you, like, had any thoughts on Rolf's response to that question, just given that you wrote a book on a similar topic.
Yes, I actually found that sort of, I understood why she gave the answer that she did, but it annoyed me on a couple of counts. And the first is that, just on a practical one, like, is the person then supposed to be like, okay, well, I'm going to call this male novelist now? And I mean, you know, she doesn't have any evidence that he hasn't asked a male novelist the same question. That's one thing, just practical. But also, I mean, I think it is important to talk about that. I mean, in my case, it's not because of any sort of, like, spiritual transformation that you undergo, but it's just, like, the financial realities. I'm always curious how people, like, make it work as a writer anyway, and if you have children, then that just, it becomes so much, all the problems you have are just amplified. So, you know, I live in San Francisco, and I have 2 children, and it costs $37,000 a year for them to be in preschool and daycare, and so that's, like, how I mean, I'm not succeeding at doing that. So, you know, I think just all artists, whether they have children or not, I think it's an act of support, like, within the community of artists, to talk honestly about how you make the financial realities work, because writing is absolutely, like, not remunerative at all, and, you know, freelancing, as you know, is a nightmare, and it's just not, you can't, like, make life work, and so if you have children, you, like, extra can't make it work, and so I think people should talk about that, so it's less of this, like, I mean, feels sort of unrelated, but, like, the guy that was, like, outed as having a job at Trader Joe's, who's previously an actor, like, oh, I mean, I've been like, can Whole Foods hire me? Like, it's really close to my house, and I would get a discount that would be very meaningful for me, and, like, I need money. So I don't understand why that's, like, people were surprised that, like, people have jobs.
Yeah. And now that I think about it, it's like, Ralph's response is it's like weirdly classist, too. To assume that, like, it's not a question that you, like, have to answer. Maybe because it doesn't impact her life, like, in the way it would impact, like, a freelancing mother.
And she also, I mean, I mean, I really, really love her work a lot, and, like, it's very integral to her work, and she has a story that has a first line that I, like, think about every single day, and it's, I have somehow become a woman who yells, and and, like, you know when you read it that the woman has children, and it's, like, I've formed, like, a whole, like, mythology around that line, and so to me, it feels a little bit like, sure, you don't have to talk about your family, but, like, it matters in your work, and I don't know. Don't tell Lauren Groff that.
Stop recording this app, please. But can you talk a bit about, like, how, like, the book is, I mean, obviously I'm not a mother, I'm going to be a mother, but the book, like, it's so visceral in the way it depicts, like, motherhood's impact on your mind and your body. Can you talk a bit about, like, how you managed to, like, get that viscerality into the novel?
Well, I think that was probably the like main thing that I wanted to try and do with the book. It's just I hadn't read anything where you were in that moment to moment with a small child, and I think that is a very interesting mental state. So it was kind of a fun challenge, not fun, a challenge, like, to think of how you could put that in writing and have it not be just really excruciating to read. And I'm, you know, I just definitely don't think I succeeded in every moment. Like, I am bored reading the book sometimes. It's just like, this is taking forever to just do the simplest thing. But that's how it feels. And what's funny is that I now have a second baby who is 11 months old, so younger than Honey is in the book. And I still sometimes have those feelings of just, like, absolute kind of exhaustion and frustration, but definitely the, like, shine is off the kind of new crazy feelings. So I'm glad that I wrote that book when I did, because I don't think that I could write it now. Yeah.
Do you think there's a kind of, like, I've been like reading the book. I kept thinking about this Toni Morrison interview. I think I emailed it to you, right? The Paris Review one.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, where the interviewer like asked her like, how did you write The Bluest Eye? And she responds that she had to wake up early in the morning for like a year to write this book. And the interviewer is like, oh, is that just like your ritual? Is that how you do it? And she's like, no, I like had a kid, so I had to like wake up at 5 in the morning to like write this book, or else it wouldn't happen. And she talks about this like a motherly subjectivity that like shapes everything, like the way you like think about the world entirely. And like, is this book like about that subjectivity, or?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think it does. It changes everything, and that's not to. I don't. There's like a gross thing that people say, like, I was never like empathetic until I had a child, and now I'm like such a much better person. And I think that's really stupid, especially some of the other women here are on a Facebook group geared at San Francisco mothers, and has 10,000 people in it, and you can see all manner of nonsense on any given day.
The one with the newspaper controversy?
Yes.
Yeah.
Alex was the one who told me about that. So you can see, people talking about other people and talking about like neighborhoods and class and race in ways that are just not, there's no evidence that like having a child has made you more empathetic. So, and that, I include myself in that. Like I think there's certain ways that you actually become more selfish when you have children, because everything now is like how you're going to, propel them through life and let them achieve, and that's not good for like a kind of collective. But yes, like it does. I felt like I wanted to write the book because I just had things happen to the way I experienced time was a big one, and place, and just a feeling for a person that I didn't have before, and I wanted to like write it down, I guess.
I found a question before we open it up to Q&A. This is kind of serious, but also kind of joking. There's only one Southern Californian in the book, Cindy Cooper, the leader of the kind of bullish leader of the Secessionists. Why is SoCal a villain for you?
Well, I am sorry. Well, no, I mean, so Cindy Cooper does a few things in the book, and so you find out that Cindy Cooper is not. She's from San Bernardino, but she came up to Alta Vista 10 years ago with an ex and stayed and just loved it. But I have met other people who have come to the North State and just say, this is my place, and I've got to stay here, and that's like a thing that happens to people. So she's sort of like a type in that way. Also, there are a lot of people. I don't really know where everyone is from in the state of Jefferson. I suspect most people who are really involved are from the North State, but with the Bundy crowd and the like kind of sagebrush rebellion, anti-government people, a lot of them they come from kind of all over, and that's interesting to me, that it's like because you do really want to belong to something, and so you don't even like need to have a vested interest in like what the cows are doing, like on the grazing lands, but you want to like join this community that's like very pissed at the government. So that's thing two. And then thing three, specific to San Bernardino, is that it takes place before the San Bernardino shootings, but Cindy has a lot of very, very Islamophobic views, which are very common in America, and are stoked at every possible juncture by mainstream media on all sides of the political spectrum, actually. And so that's sort of like an echo, kind of like she already has these views, and then this thing is going to happen that readers will know, but she doesn't know, like in her town. So that's just that.
You just made me realize too that like San Bernardino and I guess Murdoch they're very similar, right? Like they're like poverty-stricken, like white working class. Although San Bernardino is like highly Hispanic at this point, but these white working class communities that seem like completely forgotten by the rest of California, even though San Bernardino is like at the very edge of like LA County.
I've never been to San Bernardino.
There's no reason to go to San
slandering
Bernardino.
my book. Well, I don't think that can be true. I think every place is a good place to go.
Tour. And with that, I think we'll do a Q&A.
Alex.
Great. Hi, long-time admirer, first-time reader. So I was really curious about Alice in the book because she is both like at times is warm and then at other times it's not. And I couldn't tell if I wanted to like nestle into Alice or just like keep her far away. And I was curious about like where like what was sort of your inspiration for Alice and like where did she kind of come from for Daphne?
Thank you, Alex. That is a great question.
You're welcome.
So the book is dedicated to, or in memory of Phyllis Hodgson, who, sorry, this is going to seem like it really has nothing to do with this, but it just takes a little while to explain. But so Phyllis Hodgson was married to a man named Marshall Hodgson, who was kind of the foremost American Islamicist of his time and like maybe ever. He died in 1968, and he wrote this seminal 3-volume work called The Venture of Islam. And I, when I was a graduate student, was really obsessed with him and wrote my MA thesis about him. But one of the reasons that he was interesting to me is that he had a very tragic personal life. He had twin daughters and then a third daughter, and he died. The twins had a congenital illness and died very, very young, and he died also very young, and it was just really sad and a mess. And in the course of kind of researching him, I would always ask, what happened to his wife? She's in all these records mentioned as being this like tragic widow and like bereaved mother, and none of the academics I would talk with were like, oh, we just don't really know what happened to her. And then I found that she was alive, and so I went and met her in Wisconsin. She has since passed away, and I went to her funeral last year. But so I met a lot of people who had known her and who cared for her because she didn't have any family, and so she just had this sort of like community of people who looked after her. And the way that they described her and the way that she was when I met her, she was like that, like just very like warm and vivacious, but also had lived through like very, very, very horrible things, and was pissed about them, and that was like sort of her affect. And the character is not like her 100%, but she was definitely like a source of inspiration. Just someone who's like been through a lot and has no reason to be like cheerful all the time. Questions? Laura?
One of the things that struck me a lot in the book and that I thought about a lot were names of the characters, and so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you chose names for them, particularly Daphne.
Well, I was always told, I don't know if this is true, but my parents said that Daphne was one of the names they had considered naming me. So that, whether that's true or not, that's something that I had in my head. So it was like, this is my alter ego. Just like, everything is very thinly veiled.
There was a discussion with Daphne.
And and I like the myth of Daphne, being like stuck, turned into a tree. That was the long and short of it. Yes, Aaron.
I want to know how, and if this was difficult to get out of your own head as a critic. You're to have that kind of relationship with so many books, especially when, like this is a novel. This is a road novel. The wonderful New Yorker review, is putting you in the context of so many other books, and I wonder if, like the critic part of your brain that is making those connections, if that gets in your way, or if that was something you could harmonize. I'm just would like to know.
That's a great question. I felt so like evil and fraudulent when I started writing because it felt like I was betraying every person whose book I'd ever reviewed, because I reviewed it as like a a fair and unbiased reader, which is nonsense. Like that doesn't exist. And then I later realized that like anyone who's ever, the tradition of like being in like the arts and letters community is like you do the thing and then you also weigh in on other people doing the thing. So there isn't like some kind of bright line that actually exists between critics and practitioners, but it did feel like there was, or should be, like it feels kind of unethical, like that people, like novelists review other novelists, like there's just a lot of conflicts there. So there was that, I felt guilty. And then I also one of the, Ismail and I have talked a lot about this because he loves a book that I really viscerally hated, and
can we talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, so the book is Taipei by the author Tao Lim, and it's a book that I just like couldn't stand, but then so many people I respect so much like really love this book, and then actually as I was writing my book I was like, oh, I'm like copying Tao Lim. And I felt so like awful. I was like, I can't believe I was so mean about this book, but I'm actually like just I'm like operating in exactly the same tradition. So I did get in my head about things like that, but then yeah. Do you want to say something about Taipei?
No, I just want to tell a story, then I have a question. Lydia doesn't believe the story at all, but I think like in 2011, Taipei came out, and I read it and I really loved it. I thought it was a great book. And then I was like looking for info on it online, and I found a review that compared reading it to the experience of having like a lobotomy performed. And it was for a website called The Millions. And I was just like, this person is like shitting all over this book that I really, really love. But it's also like a read that like taught me how to like write good reviews as well, and it was cool to like read that and then like meet Lydia at a party like 5 years later. I think that's it. But also like, how is your book like Taipei, or how are you writing the same?
Well, like it's very it's very like up its own ass. It's very married to a particular like voice and style that it has like laid out for itself. I mean, the styles are like absolutely opposite because he uses like 7 words just in different orders. And I really love adjectives and adverbs, and it's, big and festive. So it's very, like, the style is very different, but, it's about someone who, like, is fed up with, like, being themselves. Like, I don't know. I'm not sure how far I could really take this, but it just, that was like a strong feeling I had as I was writing. I was like, I had the gall to be mean about Tao Lim, but I'm really just working in the path he forged for me.
I thought I was going to get you to finally admit that Taipei is a great book.
Maybe I'll give it a try. Time. Dad, yes.
Sorry, I can't resist. The book ends in a sort of a soft fade transition. In your own mind, do you see any, is there a happy ending on the horizon? I mean,
I don't know.
Okay.
I really don't.
Did ICD ever answer the phone?
No, I mean, I think that it would like be good to go to Turkey, maybe, if that's what happens. I mean, the thing is that there's so many depressing things that are about to happen on the like world historical stage, so it's hard to think of it as like a kind of hopeful book in that sense. But yeah, I mean, I like to think that there's like some kind of happiness in store for the individual characters, but I don't see what that is. It's not. And actually, the ending changed even after I sold the book, because I was so not invested in it one way or the other that it was like it felt like it cost nothing to change what the ending was, I guess. Thank you.
What was it like writing a road novel now? I think The Road has like a nostalgic valence in life where roads are wide and the cars are filled with chrome, and now we have Highway 80 and Nut Tree and counties that can't afford to pave the roads. So what was that sort of, did you grapple at all with the nostalgia of the road trip?
Well, I'm very susceptible to the road trip, and my husband, who's here, Tim, we've, like, my happiest memories that we have are of road trips, either just the two of us or with our kids, and we once drove we moved to Pittsburgh, and we drove from San Francisco to Pittsburgh in a 1997 Buick LeSabre, filled with all of our possessions, and it's just, the best, one of the best kind of times in my life. But every road trip is like, when seeing America is really like a both grim and like wonderful spectacle. I mean, you see like really these sights of like great environmental physical beauty, but then you just see like planning decisions that are like literally heartbreaking, and like communities that are just sort of shaped by like having highways over them, and so I think any the road novel always has to, usually you're seeing kind of a mixed bag of things, and that's the nut trees. I really can't say enough how much I hate the nut tree. It's a scourge on America. Yes.
So I know we've talked a lot about it as a road novel, but I know that you think of it as a campus novel too, and so do I, and I would love to hear you talk about that facet of it.
Yes, thank you, Lily. So the Daphne works at a university, and I once worked at a university, and some of my former colleagues are here. Hello. And I love campus novels. So David Lodge is the kind of famous campus chronicler of the university where I used to work. And I thought it was so funny that every time I felt guilty about like sort of having someone who was maybe based on a real person, I would just remember that David Lodge literally wrote the entire UC Berkeley campus, but called it SF, and just made no effort to like conceal anything. And I was like, well, if David Lodge can do it. Yeah, I mean, I think I love campus novels, but they have no stakes, and so when trying to like think about how to like put that, like babies just sort of ruin everything, and or make everything better in some respects, and so like trying to reconcile those aspects were really kind of funny and interesting for me. So there are these like campus kind of types and like celebrity academics and like weird hierarchies and things that like are endlessly fascinating to me, but they couldn't really be like the whole book because it's like I didn't want to just only like occupy that space, but that's definitely that's the thing that is being like driven away from. That's like why you need to get on the road, I guess. Yeah.
What's fascinating about those aspects about like campus and academia and like bizarre academic hierarchies?
Well, they're just so, they're so like funny and tragic. Right now, every time I think like, oh, I'm sort of mean, like, and unjust about academia, like something will happen that just like completely like corroborates like all of my worst. The thing that happened at NYU recently, just about sort of the cult of like apprenticeship and sort of the like your advisor as this person who like can ask you to pick up their dry cleaning and do all kinds of like demeaning things, and it's like okay in this kind of very specialized context that has been created. It's not funny if you're like living in that, but it's just funny that
it is not funny.
But like that is kind of coupled with these sort of high-minded ideals about like how the production of knowledge, which is it's kind of tragic because there are these people who, and there's a character like this in the book, like someone who has like really valuable stores of knowledge and information that no one else has, and is like uniquely situated to kind of share that with the world. And so that is true about them, but it's also true that they like fondle their subordinates, like, and that's not funny that happens, but it's sort of like, I don't know, it's just one of the things about academia that is like this kind of tragic, interesting thing. I don't know. That's not a good way of
tragic
putting it.
Is a key word.
Yeah.
Any more?
Yes, Vanessa. Yes, so she asked about the decision to maroon Engin, who's the husband, away from the narrative and in Turkey particularly. So, yes, one of my main problems when I was starting to write the book is that I knew that I wanted it to be a woman on her own with a child. And the reasons that a woman is on her own with a child are, there are many different sort of possibilities and they all carry their own kind of weight. And so I didn't want there to be like a dead dad because then that's like a grief book and I wasn't kind of equipped to write that. And if there's some kind of like acrimonious divorce or separation, then that's like its own kind of universe. And so it was in the most kind of cold-blooded way, it was like very convenient for me to have it be like an immigration problem, but also it was something that had happened to people that I knew that really stuck with me, that you could like find yourself in this like horrible bureaucratic nightmare that was like very kind of catastrophic for your family. And Turkey, I had lived in Turkey and at one time spoke Turkish like fairly well and was kind of very attached to it, and so it seemed that was just the only place that made sense. I mean, initially I didn't want to use Turkey for that reason because I felt more kind of obligation to not like mess it up, and so I kind of shied away from it. I was like, well, her husband can be from Denmark, which I apologize to any Danes who are here, but I was kind of like, well, it doesn't matter if I like am wrong about Denmark, but and I googled like, what is it like to be married to a Danish person? And this only lasted one day, so I really did quickly like realize that was stupid. But I mean, it is funny you can make a lot of really bad decisions in the course of trying to write a book, and hopefully you just realize them as you're doing them. And, yeah.
I have one more.
Okay.
About you brought the word boring.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking like boring is good. I kind of like.
That's why you like Type A.
You're right about that. But is there an appeal to like books that are boring, like about what they demand of us as we're reading?
Yes. And I think actually, since I have now written my own somewhat boring book, I have like a greater tolerance for other boring books. I don't know. I'm not going to have a good answer for this because I mean, also like what people find boring is just so like really is very subjective. So I don't know. I'm trying to think of a book that's really boring that I love. What's your favorite boring book? He's read every book in the entire world, so
not true at all.
I
love The Idiot.
Oh yeah, The Idiot is kind of
Bob
boring.
Timon. It's like deeply boring.
Yeah.
It's just like there are like pages that are just like catalogs of what she did with her day in Cambridge. It's about a girl who goes to college at Harvard in the late 1990s. And sometimes you just read it and you're just like, why am I reading this? Like no given episode matters at all to the narrative. And still by the end of it I was like, yeah, I love that. That was really good. Yeah, that's my example.
I guess that's my greatest hope, is that someone feels the same way after they read my book. Like they get through those kind of, because there are, parts where it's just like lugging around the baby, like basically like aimlessly wandering, like feeding the baby. It's so boring. But I don't know, that's like what life is like, and I feel like there has to be some kind of effort to put it on the page somehow. And like child rearing is it's like a big human territory, so you have to do your best to like represent it, I guess.
And with that, thank you for coming out. Thank you to Lydia.